My name is John Guest, and I'm CEO of the Houston Museum of African American Culture. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. This should be an exciting day for us. And so without further ado, let me bring our curator, who is responsible for who is responsible for our opening exhibition with Oda Binga Jones, and who thought to have this critical dialogue happen. Danielle Burns.
Good morning, everyone. Again, I'd just like to, as John just did, thank you for coming out on this raining day. I was saying that we all know what it's like. When the rain happens in Houston, people tend not to move around a lot, so thank you for coming out. I just want to do a brief introduction of all of our speakers today. First, we will have Franklin Sirman. He's the chief curator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Franklin, to name all of the exhibitions that he has curated or co-curated, or magazines that he's been editor of, is numerous, but just wanted to let you know he is working on a show about Noah Purifoy. And also just to let you know that Franklin also curated One Planet Under a Groove, and that was basically a show that changed my life. So I always mention that. So anyway, next we have Joe Havel. He is the Glassell School and core director at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. Joe has been there for over 21 years. The core program started in 1982 and is a residency program that offers postgraduate residencies for art critics and visual artists. And then we have Jada Wright, who is the current creator and author of Heritage Salon. It's an online blog that talks about African American art and history. So if you could please welcome all of our speakers. And let us begin.
I guess we're all here to talk a little bit about challenges. And I think in some ways, I can't speak for everybody, but for myself, so I think we're all being challenged to some degree in what we do and what we're trying to do as far as being artists or being curators and critics. So I guess I'm just gonna talk a little bit about some of the things that I've been working on in the last year and a half. One exhibition and then some acquisitions, and then hopefully that leads to some questions that perhaps pertain a little bit more to our topic today. I'm trying to figure out where's the best place for me to stand. Okay. So I know some of you obviously from Houston, and had a very good time here working at the Manila Collection. And now live in Los Angeles and working at Los Angeles County Museum of Art is obviously a very different experience. I mean, I still get to work in a building that was done by Renzo Piano, but a totally different Renzo Piano. Not the young man that worked with the de Menils and probably was really shaped by the de Menils in terms of what he was going to do early in his career and his first building in this country. You can see in the background here is the Broad Contemporary Art Museum. And so that's a building that he did in 2008. And it's not quite, there's something that's odd about it, and installing in there, I've installed a few shows in there. And it just is not as flexible as, say, the Manila Collection building. I think there are certain flourishes that have been added to the structure of the way that he works, and perhaps that also has something to do with the person who commissioned this building, that person being Eli Broad, who probably had a much different idea of what he wanted to show the world of himself than perhaps the de Menils did in the 80s. So you can kind of make out, some of the forms are there that are similar. But I think the reason why I like this image is because, the Manil, I think, is very much about being grounded in terms of its local surroundings, Whereas what we're often trying to do at LACMA and being directly in the center of Los Angeles is we're being challenged to bring people into the museum. I mean, it's a paying museum. There is that difference. There is that challenge. It's not cheap. But one of the things that has been important in terms of it being sort of, at least architecturally and physically, a place to bring people is that we've been trying to create this idea of a plaza. And I think that idea goes back a little bit to this building. Around 2008, and since then, the whole experience of the Los Angeles County Museum has sort of shifted from a more eastern side, where you have buildings that are from this 1965, when the museum opened, and also from the mid-'80s. So, different architecture, different times abutting against each other. And you now have this push on the western side that began with the Broad building. And I have another image where you see some of the other things that have been happening. But in the last 4 years, another gallery, another huge gallery space, one more like the sort of more simple structure of the Manil, was built, and that's called the Resnick Pavilion. So it's very much about a different kind of art experience, and it almost is a way of reflecting back on the 3-story building that you see there and wanting to do something that could be different, something that holds large-scale sculpture really, really well, as opposed to, I think, the way that the other building is broken up. But in the quest to bring people there, and I mentioned the Resnick building, we also now have a restaurant and a bar which are right across from those buildings, and have done a lot to create this idea of a plaza, of being a meeting place, a place for dialogue. Even if you're not going into the museum, people can come by for the bar. So there is this idea that we can be a sort of laboratory for ideas. One of this piece, though, the Chris Burden, which accompanied the opening of the building, it was very much about creating this idea of a beacon. I think when people think of Los Angeles, the closest thing you think of physically to any sort of landmark is perhaps the Hollywood sign, or there's like this abstract idea of the ocean being somewhere nearby. So we've been thinking about that a lot in terms of how do you situate this museum as the county museum in the center of Los Angeles and getting people in. Upstairs in that Broad building, this is probably the vision or the idea that most people think of when they think of contemporary art at LACMA. This idea, we have sort of, I think we're challenging this idea now, and I should mention that Eli Broad, who paid for the building, of course, is now opening his own museum directly across the street from the Museum of Contemporary Art in downtown Los Angeles. So the balloon dog and the cracked egg there, and I have a better image after that. Actually, you also saw Warhol Rorschach in there, so there was a little bit, some other things going on, but essentially it's an installation that centers on Koons with Andy Warhol and John Baldessari. On one hand, Warhol being the influential older artist and the iconic artist who shares some of the same, perhaps, ideas that come forth in Koons. And then on the other hand, thinking of Baldessari in the same way, but also wanting to recognize Los Angeles and Baldessari's influence as a teacher and as an artist who's been in LA for the last 50-something years. But I do believe that even with that being a full-on installation, I think what a lot of people come away with is the balloon dog and the cracked egg. Those two pieces we are now beginning to think about life after them, thank God. So they've been there ever since the building opened, and they'll be leaving next in March. And I already, people are some people are very upset, like board members even, who are like, no, you can't let that happen. I'm like, I don't really have a choice. But I think it is good for just the identity of the museum and the changing identity of the museum, and not being linked specifically to this one collector. And I think that's obviously one of the major challenges that we face as curators and people who work in museums nowadays is, where do the collections come from? There aren't exactly a lot of great collections that have been built, perhaps in the way that the Manil collection was built, at a time when you're collecting your peers, and then you have the wherewithal to go around that in a sort of eclectic way and think, to create something very special that you then want to provide to the public. I think everybody says that, but nowadays, I think of, say, the Miami situation where you have many different collectors who are all building their own museums, and it's a different way of working. So you can go to the next image. Trying to think through that. One of the ways that I tried to encounter the collection was to think through, and I should say, as the head of Contemporary, we talk about it in terms of 1968 to the present. So you have a modern art department that's dealing with the work before that, and then we're trying to think about, well, how do we look at the art of the past in the present? So one way that we did that was we did an exhibition called Human Nature, this show that really brought out a lot of the contemporary collection in that building, and it was on the whole second floor, so it was about 18,000 square feet. As a way of sort of defining what is the collection at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So we started off with this work by Bruce Nauman. And I think, unlike the Manil, where you have certain artists who have been collected in incredible depth, walk into the room of Rothko's or walk into a room of Ernst or Magritte, this collection, since 1965, has not been collected that way. It has been much more of an eclectic sort of way of collecting, and you think more about singular pieces than you do about artists. Nauman is one of the few where there actually are more than a few pieces. And so we were trying to build a collection or an idea of the collection with him in mind, and thinking about the fact that we had work from different decades, from 60s, 70s. This neon, and I have another slide, is this piece, Human Nature, from 1983, is probably one of the, I think, signature pieces in the collection, and goes towards an idea of looking at the collection that can be super broad-minded, thinking about the big issues that he sort of references in the title, but also thinking about an artist where we started off with a gallery in which we tried to talk about, well, how is the contemporary collection different from the modern collection? People are coming to a completely different space and expecting something different. So using the time frame of 1968, we talked a lot about conceptualism and how conceptualism changes the way that we look at art and begin to think about art through ideas. So that first room began with, I think, trying to talk about art and the body in particular, thinking about Nauman and this idea of the early work, being about, well, what can I make in the studio by myself? No materials. He turns the camera on and does various sort of things with the body. We also had one of the major pieces he did in mid-60s, this piece where he's sort of going through the corridor. I forget the full title, but the corridor piece, where he's squeezing his body through. It's only as wide as his shoulders. So it's this very strange kind of piece. So we had that in the first gallery. And then we also had a piece like this, David Hammond's Injustice Case. Another one that is a very, very important part of the collection, but also is dealing with this idea around that time of, how do we talk about art? How is it different? And I think that's what we wanted to really situate, was that there is this difference that happens. Of course, I think 1968, it's all somewhat arbitrary. We could have said, 67 or 69. But at the same time, we wanted to point towards, some of the things that were happening in Europe, some of hopefully evolving and nodding towards the idea that nothing is happening in a vacuum, and that the political situation around the world becomes more apparent in a lot of the work. And obviously that's happening here. This is Hammond's reenacting the trial of Bobby Seale. So when Bobby Seale was bound at the trial from the Democratic conventions, that's what you're basically getting here. So it's not just a portrait of the artist, it's actually a portrait of a political figure. And going on through that room, we also, if contemporary in the more recent sense could be defined through the Koons images, I'd say that contemporary in a more historical sense at LACMA has been defined as Southern California art and Southern California artists. And so we had that already as a line of thought, and we were trying to look beyond that. So within this first room and talking about the body, we also included, I think, a lot more artists of color and probably a lot more women. Hannah Wilkie was in this room, Anna Mendieta was in this room, Linda Benglis was in this room. So we were also thinking about that. How do we give a different take on what has been shown so far? There's the Linda Benglis. Oh, and then in the following room was a space that was sort of a nod towards minimalist strategies. So there was a wall drawing by Sala Witt. There were two sculptures by Donald Judd. There was a Fred Sandback knit piece. And then in the middle, we threw this down. And so if you did a quick scan of the room and you're thinking about your art history, you might have seen this rectangle in the middle of the floor and been thinking of someone like Carl Andre. But obviously, you get closer and it's not. This is Mona Hatum's prayer mat, which is made of these little stainless steel nails, which would be very painful if one to actually use this as a prayer mat. And then you have the compass in the center, which is pointing towards Mecca. So a whole host of other issues that go on in this minimalist object that obviously has a reference in the past, but becomes something quite different in the present. Next. Okay, so the first room was talking about the strategy of art in the body. The second room was talking about minimalist strategies. And then there was a room that was very much about assemblage tradition. And I think in some ways thinking about it as in many different ways as coming out of a European tradition that can then get discussed and perhaps more defined as an American tradition after the 1961 MoMA show, Art of Assemblage. But it's also something that I think has a really deep connection to vernacular art and craft, very specific also to America and to the American South in particular. So we had several artists in this room, including Ed Keenholz and George Herms, but then also I think a bunch of artists that came out of a more vernacular tradition. Betty Saar, who lives in LA now and has been there, she was born in the mid-20s. So somebody who's been working there for a very long time. So there is that position in Southern California, but it's also one that has roots elsewhere. Also in that room was work by John Outerbridge, and I do have some. There's John Outerbridge, a more recent work by Outerbridge. Of course, he has been making work since the 60s, was a co-founder, along with Noah Purifoy, of the Watts Towers Art Center, and a real force in LA, and somebody who has gotten a lot more popular in the last year via the Pacific Standard Time Initiative of the Getty Museum. It's a bad image of Noah Purifoy's Last Supper that I think I took in somebody's kitchen. You can kind of make out there are like these plates that are made out of the tops of coffee cans and some dishes that are taken from used sardine cans. So all of this sort of found material that he's using to create his Last Supper. Purifoy is an artist that as Danielle mentioned, I'm working on this solo exhibition of his work. He's an artist who was born in Alabama in 1917. Great Migration, came to LA in the 50s, and worked as a designer and as a furniture maker, was making like hi-fi stereo furniture and stuff like that. And then around the time of the Watts Rebellion, he kind of had this epiphany. I mean, he had already started making a little bit of work, but around that time he really sort of found his calling and did a big piece called 66 Signs of Neon. And that was taken all from the refuse and detritus of the Watts Rebellion. So that became his first sort of grand work. And that piece actually, since, in Houston, and thinking about him is the connection with Walter Hopps. Before Hopps ever got here, when he was still working in Los Angeles, he was very close with Noah Purifoy. And late 60s, early 70s, when Hopps moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the Washington Gallery of Art, the first show he did there was at Keenholz. The second show he did there was Noah Purifoy, and it was part of the 66 Signs. So there is that connection that I've been interested in following. The last room, I think, that defined this idea of a post-conceptual sort of trajectory and tried to say this is how the contemporary is different from the modern, was a room that was dedicated to text works. And so this Glenn Ligon Rukin figure, which is now in the exhibition in Fort Worth in his solo show, we first put it in the context of this larger exhibition in a room with works. It was in the same room as the Neon by Baldessari. And Glenn also talks about the influence of Baldessari as being something that made him want to use neon in his own work. Of course, much better known as a painter. Next. The other thing that happens, and since I don't have more images of that text room, I also mentioned there was a piece by Mel Bachner in there that was a piece that's done on the wall directly called Language is Not Transparent. And in that piece, it's kind of going towards the idea that, yes, although we are taking on these more perhaps conceptual strategies and in some cases even didactic strategies, is it necessarily, more transparent than the abstract painting? Probably not in some ways. Okay, and then moving on, so once we get rid of this, we've set down this foundation and we go on to talk about how perhaps international the collection then possibly can be. Because I think there was a real core of looking at it again, as I mentioned, as a Southern California thing, and we wanted to try and evolve from that position. So we passed Namjoon Pak and then Alighiero Boetti, the Italian artist who made these incredible mappa pieces, embroideries that were done in collaboration with women in Afghanistan. And this is a really great example, and also is great in terms of talking about chronology in an exhibition, because you see the chronology here and you can see how the world has changed. Obviously, I mean, the USSR does not exist like that. The map defining South Africa is completely different now. The Middle Eastern map is much different. Yugoslavia no longer there. So you have this document, this beautiful document that also speaks to the passage of time. Dohos, we also have a large Korean initiative at the museum and recognizing, I think, that presence in Los Angeles. And Doho was part of a big group show that happened a couple of years ago that actually came to the MFA, Your Bright Future. So we also were trying to keep in mind what is our exhibition history and how do we work off of that? Not only what is in the collection, but what has been discussed as as a hallmark of showing art at the museum. Gerhard Richter's 48 portraits. I mean, in some cases there are these, I think, standout works. This is obvious. This is not the edition of paintings that he created for the German pavilion at 1972's Venice Biennial, but they went back in 98 and did this 4 sets of photo reproduction. So still, I think, a very monumental type work that sat in a bridge gallery all by itself. And there are probably 2 or 3 Richters in the collection, which isn't a lot, I think, when we take into account how important he is as an artist over the last 50 years. For a museum that big, it would be nice if we had more. Next. Kerry James Marshall, De Style, great painting by this artist, and there is an LA connection in that. Although most identified with Chicago at this point, Kerry went to Otis as an art student, consciously went there to seek out Charles White, the great draftsman, to work with him. As did David Hammonds as well, went to LA also looking to work with Charles White. So this piece came into the collection relatively early on. I think while Kerry was still in LA. And although born in Birmingham, actually spent most of his growing up in Los Angeles. So, this wonderful piece. Next one. And Zhang Wan, some work from 2007 that we were just gifted last year. And again, I'm going into some acquisitions, reminds me about how the challenge of trying to collect art, and you look at the auction prices, or it is truly a challenge. This was a gift from a collector who has worked with the museum a lot, a woman named Audrey Hermes, who has gifted a lot of portraiture specifically to the collection. So we were fortunate to be able to include this work. Paul Pfeiffer, again, another recent acquisition, and somebody that I should mention my colleague Christine Kim, we worked on the exhibition together, and both of us have been friends and interested in Paul's work for a really long time. So we were lucky to get this piece. And what you can't get out of this, obviously, is it's a moving video, a very staticky moving video, though. These are videos in which Paul did the 3 big Muhammad Ali fights and actually removed the figures of the fighters. So in this case, it was him and Sonny Liston. And so you have this sort of focus on the spectacle of the crowd, and you can see people going up and down, and it's sort of like these ghost figures that are moving. It's just a really meditative and beautiful video. Robert Mapplethorpe. Last year, along with the Getty, and these are the kind of things that happen, I guess, the idea of collaboration to face the challenge of acquisitions. Along with the Getty, we acquired the remaining archive of Robert Mapplethorpe. So it's something like, 500 different photographs and negatives, archival materials. And we used this image as a way of setting up, I think, a discussion on strategies in the early 90s by many artists to talk about issues of portraiture and of self-identity in particular. So this piece was kind of a setup to look at works by Lorna Simpson, Yinka Shonibari, and some others. Next one. The Shonibari piece there. Again, thinking about portraiture, thinking about identity, thinking about costume. Cindy Sherman was also in that room. And then wanting to end with something of a nod back to Southern California and back to LA and artists that we are living and working with right now. So Mark Bradford, there's a great painting that came into the collection through a program called Art Here and Now, which allows us to purchase and give an award for a young LA artist. Otherwise, of course, now there's no way we can afford a Mark Bradford. And there's the Rukin figure again, because we also had it not only in the context of that group exhibition, but in the context of the big solo show that's now in Fort Worth. So this was actually the first acquisition I think that I made in Los Angeles. And with the idea that we were going to be taking that solo show, we tried to acquire a couple of pieces beforehand because he was not yet represented in the collection, and had the opportunity to buy this piece, one of his more recent neons that came about after the election of Obama, but also came out of his feelings on looking at the war in Afghanistan and Iraq and thinking about how backwards perhaps America is, but yet also how it can be a sort of beacon of light. So you had these different iterations or on America that Glenn did. A video piece, Death of Tom, which is a collaboration between Glenn and the friend Jason Moran from Houston. So we also purchased this work before the exhibition. Next one. And then there's just a few views from the exhibition in LA. And you can see the 3 America neons there in the bottom right of different variations. One view of the Ligon at the top, and then a view of another exhibition that was on at the same time by an artist collective called OSCO. And that's a group of artists who came together in the 1970s, all went to high school together on the east side of LA, and talked about a lot of Chicano issues in that exhibition, and that was going on at the same time. Another recent acquisition, piece by Ai Weiwei. Next one. And that was done with the idea that we were going to have the big zodiac sculpture that's on its way to Houston. Next one. And Christian Marclay, definitely one of our bigger acquisitions. Very happy to say that I think it's an addition of 6. And so we were able to get this piece, which has been a real boon for the collection and for the museum. And this is where I think we face the challenge of not having an in-depth collection around artists, is that you go for works that perhaps are their sort of, what do you say, their biggest pieces, Gesamtkunstwerk, trying to I think about it in a completely different way. We're not gonna get 20 works of Marclay, and as I said with Bradford, we're already priced out. So we're thinking like this, and that was one way to do it. Next piece. So just another 4 screenshots of this piece in which he's sewn together and remixed thousands of cuts from movies. And just if you don't know, for a piece that lasts 24 hours, so it's a durational video. This is a little sketch by Howardina Pindell that was also a recent acquisition, and I think that's been a priority as well. I think LACMA has had a somewhat rocky relationship with its African American artist community, and so it's something that we think of. So I was very happy that this piece recently came in. And then also we were able to recently purchase a sketchbook called the Ruth Waddy sketchbook. And Ruth Waddy was an artist and a curator primarily in the 60s. Along with Samela Lewis, she did one of the first real definitive books on black artists. So this is a piece by Noah Purifoy, and see it says From Signs of Neon at the top. So he's referencing back that piece I mentioned, 66 Signs of Neon. A couple more pieces from the sketchbook. On the left, Varnette Honeywood, and on the right, David Hammons, one that you would not necessarily identify with him. She was able to get him to do this piece in the sketchbook in 1983, and he did a quick little portrait. On the left, Lois Mailou Jones, and on the right, Dana Chandler. And would she go around and ask these artists to draw her? Totally. She was given an empty sketchbook by the Washington, D.C. artist, E.J. Montgomery. And supposedly Vanjie said, go around, you go to all these conferences, you know all these artists, please go around and get them all to fill this up. And that's exactly what she did. Which one? Ruth Waddy, it's the Ruth Waddy sketchbook. The artist on the left is Lois Mailou Jones. And look, this is the Romare Bearden. So, there's a range. I'm giving you a selection, of course, but there's about 100 different pieces in this sketchbook, and we'll have it on view in a few years. Recent acquisition, and this is the other place where we can meet the sort of acquisition challenge. You go super young, looking at artists, who are in the core program. Perhaps we can afford you, I hope. This is an artist who just graduated from Cal Arts 2 years ago. Her name is Alex Olson, and she shows with Lisa Cooley, who used to work here in Houston. So we were able to get this piece very early on. I mean, you know how it is. In 2 years, I don't even know if we can afford it anymore. Excellent. Larry Walker is a piece that came into the collection recently as well. I think that. Oh, and Bruce Nauman. Back to the idea of the big sort of spectacular piece and how to deal with the fact that we're not collecting necessarily artists in depth. So this is a video piece that is projected on a 2-sided screen, and it's about 20 feet wide and about 20 feet tall and 12 feet wide. And it's a huge sound piece. So you have these 4 big speakers in all corners of the room where he is basically telling you what he's doing with his hands. It's called For Beginners, and he's doing all the combinations of the thumb and fingers and saying it. So it's this very sort of almost monotonous type piece. It almost becomes quite trance-like. And that's it. Thank you.
So Franklin, we could entertain about 3 questions.
Okay. It has been. I mean, I should mention the director there came on in 2006. So I think there has been a difference in the way that the museum has worked since then. And the acquisition strategy has definitely been ramped up. And I mean, for me, that was important. And especially about trying to identify certain artists that have been overlooked was also something that we've very much been trying to work on.
And I gather diversity was also a major part.
Big time.
I might have missed it. You mentioned earlier about the permanent exhibition for those dog and the crack day was leaving.
Yes.
What's in its place? What's coming?
Well, we have there's a Chris Burden piece that's going to go in for a little while. And in some ways, it goes back to the collector thing. So we have a board member named Nicholas Bergruin, who in some ways, I think people might say that he can fill the void that has been left by Eli Broad. So he's been making big acquisitions. I don't have the image, but we have a piece called Metropolis that opened about a month ago. And it's a piece that Chris Burden was working on for the last 4 years with thousands of Matchbox cars going around this futuristic-looking city. Sits in a room about the size of this room, built a scaffold all around it so that you can look down upon it. And it actually has someone standing in the middle as like a conductor. So it's a quite intricate piece. And that was a purchase of Nicholas Bergruin. It's a 10-year loan. So we're making a connection with that piece. And then what I'd like to do is still, while we have the relationship, build upon the strength of the Broad collection, which is primarily in the 80s. I think some of the best work that they have comes from the 80s. So trying to build upon that and give a different taste of that collection. Whereas it's big in a lot of painters like Ross Bleckner, Eric Fischel, David Saleh. We'd like to show a little bit more of a political view by synergizing it with our collection. So you're going to get a little bit of Sherry Levine, some Barbara Kruger, Robert Gober, Katie Noland, artists like that who are working simultaneously or at the same time.
One more question.
Pacific Standard Time, would you suggest that it was a big undertaking? What's the lasting legacy for the arts community in Montana?
The archive that has been created from the research that went on in the process of putting together those shows, I think is phenomenal. The books, I mean, Eugene just gave me a copy of one of them. The books that have been created from those shows is incredible. I probably would not be able to do the solo exhibition on Noah Purifoy had Kelly Jones not done the show at the Hammer called Now Dig This, which was about black art in LA from 1960 to 1980. And Purifoy ended up looking like a genius in that show. She put him in the middle of a room where you could see how he influenced so much work that came after him, especially somebody like Hammonds. So I think that's the thing that's coming forth. And also speaking toward that idea of diversity, because it was an opportunity for people to go back and look at artists that were overlooked. So you have a lot of artists who are, I think the spotlight is back. Judy Chicago even, I mean, not somebody who lost the spotlight, but somebody who is being looked at in a different way right now. So I think that's the legacy.
Thank you so much. We're going to take a